He wasn't supposed to be there that night. A quiet man. A father. A cup of coffee going cold on a diner counter. Then the glass exploded, and Brenner Whitaker made a choice in the space of a single heartbeat that would drag him back into the darkest chapter of his past, expose a conspiracy reaching into the highest corridors of power, and force him to face the man responsible for destroying his life 12 years ago. He thought those days were behind him forever. He was wrong. If this kind of story grips you, men who carry their scars quietly, women with secrets too dangerous to speak, and the moment everything collides, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Don't leave before the ending. The best part is still coming. The rain had been falling for 3 hours without stopping when Brenner Whitaker pushed open the door of Harbor Light Diner. It was 11:47 at night. The place was nearly empty. A trucker hunched over a plate of eggs near the window, an older couple sharing pie at the back booth, a teenage kid with earbuds staring at his phone. The overhead lights gave everything a yellowish cast, the kind that makes people look a little tired even when they aren't. Brenner took his usual stool at the far end of the counter, the one with a clear sightline to both exits. Old habit. He didn't think about it anymore. It was simply where he sat. The woman behind the counter glanced up and gave him the look that meant she'd already started his coffee. "Long night?" she asked, setting the mug in front of him. "All of them," he said. Her name tag read Tess. She'd been working the late shift at Harbor Light for about 6 weeks now, and Brenner had spoken maybe 40 words to her across all of those evenings combined. She was polite without being warm, efficient without being cold. She moved behind that counter like someone who had learned to take up less space than she was entitled to. He noticed things. He always noticed things. It was a problem, his daughter Maya used to say. "You look at people like you're running a threat assessment, Dad." It's weird. Maybe it was weird. But it had also kept him alive in places most people never wanted to think about. Brenner wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth work into his knuckles. He was 37 years old, and some mornings his hands felt like they belonged to a man 20 years older. That happened when you'd spent a decade and a half putting them through things they were never designed for. He'd been out of the Navy SEALs for 9 years. He'd been out of the contracting work for 6. He ran a small auto repair shop on Callaway Street now. He paid his bills. He kept irregular hours. He didn't bother people, and they didn't bother him. Occasionally, Maya drove in from the city, and they had dinner and pretended the years of distance between them were a lot smaller than they actually were. It was a life. Not the one he'd imagined at 22, but it was a life. He had almost finished his first cup when the window exploded. The sound wasn't dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you. A bullet punching through plate glass at close range is sharp and hollow at the same time. And the first fraction of a second is so strange that the brain doesn't immediately register it as violence. It registers it as wrongness. Something in the world has gone badly incorrect, and then the body has to decide what to do before the brain catches up. Brenner was off the stool before the second shot fired. He wasn't thinking. Thinking takes too long. His body simply went. 9 years of civilian life stripped away in the time it took the second bullet to tear through the counter display and send shattered glass across the floor. He saw the trajectory. The second shot had been aimed at Tess. She was already dropping behind the counter, some survival instinct pushing her down, but she was in the wrong position. If whoever was out there adjusted their angle, she had nowhere to go. Brenner vaulted the counter. He landed hard beside her, one hand already on her shoulder, pushing her flat. "Stay down," he said. "Don't move, don't talk, just stay." "What is stay down?" He came up in a controlled crouch, scanning the shattered window. Rain and darkness outside. A parked car at the wrong angle, a door hanging open, a shape moving in the shadows. Brenner looked at the trucker by the window. "Get on the floor." "Now," he pointed at the older couple in the back. "Back booth, slide under." "Kid." The teenager had ripped his earbuds out and was staring with his mouth open. "On the ground." "Move." He said it the way he'd once given orders in places where not following them immediately meant you died. The tone cut through the shock. All 4 of them moved. The front door burst open. The man who came through was broad and carried himself like someone who had done this before, but he made the mistake of coming in fast and upright, gun already raised, expecting to find targets in the open. He found the diner rearranged. No clear angles. A counter between him and everything that mattered. Brenner came from the left side. He didn't give the man a moment to adjust. 2 seconds of controlled, deliberate force disarm, control, neutralize. The gun skittered across the linoleum. The man went down hard, wrist locked at an angle that made continuing to fight a very painful proposition. Brenner put a knee on him and looked toward the windows. 2 more figures were retreating into the darkness. He let them go. His priority was the people in the diner. He released the man on the floor, unconscious now, not from being struck but from the shock and pain, and moved back toward the counter. "Tess," he said quietly. "You okay?" She came up slowly from behind the counter, and Brenner saw something cross her face that he didn't expect. Not panic. Not the blank shock of someone who had never been near violence before. Something more complicated than that. She was pale. Her hands were shaking. But her eyes were doing something methodical, scanning the diner, counting the customers, checking the exits. That was not what a waitress did. "The others," she said. They're fine." He kept his voice level. "Everybody stay where you are for now. Don't go near the windows." He pulled out his phone and dialed. He made 3 calls in rapid succession emergency services, a contact name that he hadn't used in 4 years, and 1 more number that he hesitated before dialing but called anyway. Then he stood there in the wreckage of the diner, water dripping through the shattered window, and watched Tess. She had moved to the teenager and was crouching beside him, one hand on his back, saying something quiet and steady. Then she moved to the older couple, then to the trucker. She was doing a circuit of the survivors, and she was good at it, the right words, the right touch, the right amount of calm in her voice to keep everyone from tipping into full panic. She'd done this before, too. "What exactly are you?" Brenner thought. He didn't ask, not yet. The police arrived in 11 minutes. The federal presence arrived in 14. Brenner had his hands visible and his ID ready, and he spent the next 40 minutes answering questions from 2 detectives who were professional but clearly not sure what to make of him. He told them exactly what had happened and left out nothing except the names from his 3rd phone call. They took the man he'd subdued into custody. He was already talking about lawyers. Tess was across the diner being interviewed by a different pair of officers. Brenner watched her without watching her peripherally, the way he'd trained himself to monitor multiple points without making it obvious. She was consistent, controlled. She gave them a name and an address, and a story that was technically true in every detail, and somehow felt like it was missing its entire foundation. It was another 40 minutes before the federal agents cleared most of the scene, and the civilians were allowed to leave. Brenner stayed. He was finishing his third coffee. Somehow the percolator behind the counter had survived the chaos intact when Tess came back and stood on the other side of the counter from him. She looked like someone who had run a very long race and had not yet decided whether she'd won or lost. "You're still here," she said. "Coffee's good." "A beat." "You took that man apart like you'd done it 100 times, she said. "More than that," Brenner said. He looked at her. "You're not just a waitress." It wasn't a question. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the particular exhaustion of someone whose carefully maintained cover story has just developed its first visible crack. "I'm whatever I need to be tonight," she said. That's a non-answer. "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the rain had slackened to a thin drizzle. Red and blue lights still pulsed from the street. Through the broken window, the night air came in cold and smelling of wet pavement. Then Brenner saw them. Headlights, not 1 pair, many. He was off the stool before the first vehicle stopped. "Get back." Now, he was counting. 1 vehicle. 3, 6, 8. 12 black cars arranged across the width of the street outside the diner, with the kind of precision that doesn't happen by accident. He could see shapes in the dim light, men stepping out, umbrellas going up, a formation that was organized and deliberate. More than 20 of them. "Tess," Brenner said quietly, positioning himself between her and the door. "Who knows you're here?" She was silent for 3 seconds. "More people than I wanted," she said. The door opened. A man walked in who moved like someone who had never in his life been required to hurry. He was somewhere in his early 60s, silver-haired, dressed in a dark overcoat that hadn't come off any rack, and he carried himself with the particular weight of someone who had spent decades making other people afraid. Not through anger or bluster, through certainty. The absolute certainty that whatever happened next would happen according to his preferences. He looked at Brenner first, unhurried, evaluating. Then he looked at Tess. Something moved across his face too quick to name, but it was human, whatever it was. "Teresa," he said. The air in the diner changed. Tess had gone completely still. "I was told there was an incident," the man said. He looked back at Brenner. "You're the one who brought her through it." "Who are you?" Brenner said. He hadn't moved. His body was still positioned between this man and Tess, which under the circumstance was either instinct or stubbornness, probably both. The man extended his hand. Lucian Vossler, he said. The name hit Brenner like something physical. He didn't shake the hand. 12 years. That name had lived in a locked room in the back of his mind for 12 years, attached to a series of events that had cost him everything: his career, his reputation, a version of his life that he had spent the years since trying to reconstruct from whatever pieces remained. He'd never been able to prove the connection, never been able to put a hand around it and pull it into the light. But the name had been there in the margins of everything he'd lost. Vossler. Lucian looked at Brenner's expression and understood immediately that he was known. He lowered his hand. You recognize the name, he said. I recognize it, Brenner said. Lucian nodded slowly. There was no guilt in his face, but there was something that might have been acknowledgement, the look of a man who understood that certain debts existed, whether or not he intended to pay them. You saved my daughter, Lucian said. Brenner turned. He looked at Tessa, who was watching him, with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something between guilt and relief and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing alone for a very long time. Your daughter, Brenner said. Flat. Not a question. I know how this looks, Tessa said. Tell me anyway. She crossed her arms. Not defensively, it seemed more like she was holding herself together. My name is Tessa Marlowe. The Tess on the name tag is real. It's what people used to call me. The waitress part isn't. I've been here 6 weeks because I needed somewhere I wouldn't be found. I needed time to figure out my next move. Against who? She glanced at her father. Lucian spoke. That's a conversation that requires more than a diner counter and broken windows. Then give me the short version, Brenner said. He wasn't looking at Lucian. He was looking at Tessa. Who sent the men with the guns? She didn't hesitate. Someone inside my father's organization who wants both of us dead before we can cooperate with federal investigators. Brenner was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee mug. It was empty. He set it back down. 9 years he'd managed to stay out of rooms like this one, out of conversations like this one, out of situations where powerful people with complicated histories and violent enemies made their problems his problem. 9 years. He looked at Tessa, at the steadiness in her eyes underneath the fear, at the way she'd moved through this diner, taking care of strangers, while her own world was falling apart, and he felt something shift inside him that he didn't particularly want to examine right now. Then he looked at Lucian Vossler. 12 years of answers, maybe. 12 years of a locked door that he'd never been able to open. The rain fell outside. The lights of 12 black cars still lit the street. All right, Brenner said, talk. Lucian Vossler did not sit down uninvited. He stood at the center of the diner with rain-damp shoulders, and the kind of patience that only comes from decades of being the most dangerous person in any room, and he waited while Brenner decided whether or not the conversation was going to happen at all. Brenner decided it was, not because he trusted Lucian, not because Tessa's eyes were asking him to, but because 12 years of not knowing had worn a groove in him that he was tired of carrying, and whatever this man knew, Brenner wanted it. Sit down, Brenner said. He didn't say it like an invitation. Lucian sat. Tessa remained standing, which told Brenner something about the relationship between father and daughter, the specific distance of two people who share blood and almost nothing else. Your organization, Brenner said, keeping his voice low. The federal agents were still processing the scene outside. 2 had remained in the diner, but they were near the front, occupied with documentation. Someone inside it tried to kill your daughter tonight. Yes, Lucian said. And you knew she was here. I found out 2 days ago. I was arranging to move her before anyone else. He paused, chose his words. Before the timeline accelerated. His timeline, Tessa said from where she stood. There was an edge in her voice that had nothing to do with the evening's events. It had been there a long time. He means Garrick. Garrick Sloan, Lucian said. He folded his hands on the counter in front of him. He has been my second in command for 11 years. He is also the man who has been systematically dismantling everything I attempted to dismantle first. Brenner looked at him steadily. Explain that. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car door closed. Rain pattered through the broken window onto the linoleum. I made decisions over many years that I cannot undo, Lucian said. I built structures that caused harm. I understood that eventually those structures would either be brought down by someone outside my control or taken apart by me. I chose to be the one to take them apart. He glanced at Tessa. Teresa discovered evidence that accelerated the situation. He means I found the ledger, Tessa said. Brenner looked at her. There is an encrypted financial record, she said. It documents 11 years of activity, money laundering, bribery, payments connected to violent incidents. Garrick maintained it as insurance. He thought it was hidden. He didn't know that I had been looking. Why were you looking? She met his eyes. Because I inherited financial interests connected to my father's holdings when I became CEO of Marlowe Meridian Group. I didn't know what those interests actually were until I started pulling threads. A beat. I pulled a lot of threads. She discovered what Garrick had done with the legitimate companies, Lucian said. He used them as instruments moving money, creating documentation that appeared clean, obscuring payments for activities that were not. His voice remained even, but there was something underneath it that was harder to name. He did this without my knowledge, or so he claims. In truth, I suspect he operated in the shadow of things I chose not to examine closely enough. The honesty of that last sentence surprised Brenner. He hadn't expected it. So Sloan has the ledger, Brenner said. Garrick knows the ledger exists, Tessa said. He doesn't have it. I do, and he wants it. He wants it destroyed, she said. And he wants me dead before I can give it to federal investigators. And he wants my father dead before my father can voluntarily cooperate. She paused. And now he knows someone helped me survive tonight, which means he'll want to understand who you are and whether you're a problem. Brenner was quiet. He picked up the empty mug, looked at it, set it down again. Small action. Something to do with his hands while he thought. He had spent 6 weeks drinking coffee in this diner, watching this woman move behind that counter, thinking she was someone trying to stay small and stay safe. He had respected that. He understood wanting to stay small and stay safe. He had not imagined she was holding evidence capable of dismantling a criminal network while running from the man who wanted her buried. The ledger, he said. Where is it? Safe, Tessa said. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight. He looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze without flinching. He almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough, he said. He turned back to Lucian. The name Vossler, Brenner said. 12 years ago. There was an operation. I was working private security under contract post-Navy, defense adjacent. The operation went wrong. People died who weren't supposed to die. I was blamed. He kept his voice very flat, very steady. The investigation that followed ended my career and nearly ended other things. In the margins of that investigation, the name Vossler appeared. In documents I wasn't supposed to see. Lucian did not look away. I know, he said, 2 words. Brenner had expected denial, had prepared for it. The absence of it landed like something solid dropped on a table. You know, Brenner repeated. I know what happened in 2013, Lucian said. I know what was done to you. I did not orchestrate it directly. But I was aware that my organization had connections to the people who did, and I chose at the time to protect those connections rather than disclose them. He paused. That is a debt that exists regardless of what you decide about tonight. Brenner sat with that. 12 years of a locked door. It had just opened, and what was on the other side was exactly what he'd suspected, not a dramatic revelation, not some elaborate conspiracy with a single mastermind. Just a powerful man who had known and chosen and moved on. He felt the anger. He knew it was there. But it was a cold anger, the kind that had been sitting in a drawer for over a decade and had lost its heat. What replaced it was something more complicated and harder to work with. Who did the actual work? Brenner said. In 2013, who ran the betrayal? Lucian's eyes shifted very slightly. That, he said, is also part of what Garrick doesn't want to come out. Brenner understood. Garrick Sloan. The name landed and rearranged 12 years of questions into a shape that finally made sense. They talked for another hour. Not everything was shared, not all at once. Information in rooms like this one gets rationed the way. Water gets rationed in a place without enough of it, enough to keep people alive, not enough for anyone to feel comfortable. Lucian was careful. Tessa was careful in different ways. Brenner listened more than he spoke, which was his natural state, and he filed things in the ordered system that years of intelligence work had built in the back of his mind. By the time the federal agents finished their documentation and the diner had been officially released from immediate crime scene status, Brenner had a rough map of the situation. Garrick Sloan controlled Lucian's operational infrastructure, the people, the routes, the financial channels, the relationships with those in positions of institutional authority who had been paid to look in other directions. When Lucian had begun the process of cooperating with federal investigators, Garrick had understood that cooperation meant the dismantling of everything Garrick had spent 11 years building and controlling. It meant exposure. It meant the end of arrangements that had made Garrick personally wealthy and operationally powerful, in ways that went far beyond his formal role. Garrick's solution was straightforward. Eliminate Lucian before Lucian could cooperate. Eliminate Tessa before she could surrender the ledger. And if the evidence pointed toward a convenient third party, a former military operative with a complicated history, perhaps one already connected in old records to the Vossler organization, then so much the better. Brenner would be a useful scapegoat. He had the background. He had the connection, however marginal. He had a story that could be made to look damning without too much effort. Garrick had done exactly that kind of work before. Brenner drove home at 3 a.m. through rain-slicked streets. His apartment was on the second floor of a converted building on the east side of the city, 3 rooms, functional, the kind of space that said its occupant was practical and had stopped expecting more than practicality a while ago. He'd kept it cleaner since Maya stopped coming around as often. Easier to maintain empty space than a home. He changed out of his damp clothes and stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on the lights. He thought about the diner. He thought about Tessa's hands on the teenager's back, steadying him. He thought about Lucian's 2 words, "I know," and the strange relief and fury they'd produced simultaneously. He thought about Garrick Sloan, and a name that had spent 12 years living in the margins of his memory. He did not think about what he was going to do next, because he already knew, and he needed a few hours before he was ready to admit it. He went to bed. He slept badly. He was up before 5. His repair shop on Calloway Street was called Whitaker's, which was the least creative name he could have given it, and therefore exactly right. The sign was clean, the bays were organized, and he employed 2 mechanics who were better at their jobs than Brenner was, and who showed up on time and didn't ask questions about why the owner sometimes arrived with bruised knuckles and left again before noon. He arrived at 6:45 the next morning. The front door was unlocked. He stopped. He always locked that door. He had locked it the previous evening before walking to the diner, as he did every evening, checking it twice in the particular ritual of a man who understood that small security habits kept you alive longer. He pushed the door open and stood in the frame, not entering yet, scanning. The shop had been searched. Not ransacked, not overturned and destroyed. Searched, which was worse in a way, because it meant someone who was professional and patient rather than angry and hurried. Drawers had been opened and closed again. Files had been moved and replaced. The desk in the back office had been gone through with the kind of thoroughness that left almost no visible trace. Almost. The photograph on the corner of his desk had been moved. It was the only photograph he kept in the shop. His daughter Maya, 23 years old, laughing at something off camera at her college graduation 3 years ago. He'd had it in a particular spot against the corner of the desk lamp for so long that the slight discoloration of the desk's surface marked where it had lived. Someone had picked it up, looked at it, set it back down 6 inches to the left. Beside the photograph sat a single bullet. Brenner did not touch anything. He stood very still and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had been many things over the years. He had been afraid, though he had trained himself to process fear as information rather than paralysis. He had been angry, though he had learned to set anger aside until it was useful. He had been hurt, though he had developed a high tolerance for that in every sense of the word. What moved through him now was different. It was a father's fear, which operates on an entirely different frequency than any other kind, and it was the most clarifying emotion he had ever experienced. He called Maya. She picked up on the 3rd ring, voice thick with sleep. "Dad, it's not even 7. Are you home?" A pause. "Yeah." "Why? Stay there. Don't go out today. Don't tell anyone where you are." "Can you do that?" Another pause, longer. He could hear her waking up properly now. Maya was sharp. She had always been sharp. "Dad, what happened?" "I'll explain later. Right now I need to know you're somewhere safe." "I'm in my apartment." "Good. Stay there. I'll call you by noon." He hung up before she could ask the questions he didn't have time to answer. Then he called Tessa. She picked up on the 1st ring, which told him she hadn't slept either. "They were at my shop," he said, a beat of silence. "Then, are you hurt?" "No, they left something." He looked at the bullet beside Maya's photograph. A message. Garrick, her voice was flat, not surprised the opposite. The flatness of someone who had anticipated this and still felt sick when it arrived. "He found out about you faster than I expected." "How much do they know about Maya?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm sorry. I don't know what they've found." He sat down in the desk chair. He looked at the photograph of his daughter laughing at her graduation. She had her mother's laugh, wide and unguarded, the kind you could not manufacture. "Tell me what you need," Tessa said. "I'm not doing this for you," he said. "You understand that." "I know, and I'm not working for your father." "I wouldn't ask you to." He was quiet for a moment. "I need access to everything you have on Sloan," he said. "Every connection, every name, every piece of the organizational structure. And I need to know exactly where that ledger is, because if Garrick is moving this fast, we're not going to have the luxury of being careful about sharing information." "Okay," she said. "And I need somewhere other than my shop and my apartment." "I have a place," she said. "It's not comfortable." "That's fine, Brenner," she said and stopped. "What?" "Thank you for last night." For she stopped again. "I'm not good at this part." "Then don't do it," he said. It came out sharper than he intended. He took a breath. "We can sort through everything else after this is finished. Right now I need an address." She gave him one. The place was a mid-level corporate apartment in the kind of building that exists primarily for people passing through, furnished with bland efficiency, anonymous corridors, a lobby with a front desk that asked no questions as long as a card was swiped correctly. It smelled like recycled air and industrial carpet cleaner and the particular neutrality of a space that had housed hundreds of temporary lives without absorbing any of them. Tessa was already there when Brenner arrived, along with a woman he hadn't seen before. She was standing at the kitchen table over a spread of documents and a laptop, and she looked up when Brenner entered with the expression of someone who had been expecting him and had already decided she didn't have time to waste on pleasantries. "Nadine Mercer," she said. "Federal investigator. I've been building the case against the Vossler organization for 22 months. She looked at him carefully. "I know who you are, Mr. Whitaker. I've read the file from 2013. Then you know I was framed." "The file is ambiguous," she said. "That's by design. Someone worked very hard to make it ambiguous." She glanced at Tessa. "The ledger will clean it up, along with several other things." Brenner put his bag down and came to the table. The documents spread across it were organized in the methodical way of someone who had lived inside this material for a very long time. Photographs, organizational charts, financial summaries, surveillance logs. In the center was a printed photograph of a man in his mid-50s, heavy-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the flat, watchful eyes of someone who had spent a career assessing threats before they materialized. Garrick Sloan. Brenner studied the photograph. There was nothing dramatic about the face. No movie villain sharpness. He looked like a man who ran logistics for a mid-sized company and coached his kids' football team on weekends. That was always how it was. The people who could cause the most damage tended to look like the least amount of anything. "He has people inside Lucian's security team," Brenner said. Nadine nodded. "We believe so. At least one, possibly two. And inside the police department. One that we've identified, possibly others. So anything that moves through official channels gets to Garrick before it gets anywhere useful," she said. "Yes. Which is why Tessa and I have been operating outside those channels for the past 3 weeks." A pause. "And why your involvement, while not exactly what I planned for, may actually be more useful than having another federal agent." "You want someone outside the system," Brenner said. "I want someone who can do things that federal investigators can't," she said, with the directness of someone who had decided that efficiency mattered more than careful phrasing. "Garrick's people are watching every official move. They have the framework to counter anything procedural, but an individual operating independently that's harder to anticipate." Tessa was watching Brenner across the table. He could feel the weight of what was being asked without anyone asking it directly. He'd walked away from this life. He'd built something deliberately small and deliberately quiet because he had done the math and understood that the life he'd been trained for had costs that exceeded what it paid, and the people who paid most of those costs were the people nearby when things went wrong. He had a dead wife and a daughter he'd spent years trying to reach across a distance largely of his own making. He did not romanticize who he'd been in his 20s and 30s. But he also could not look at the bullet someone had placed beside his daughter's photograph and then go home and fix engines and pretend it hadn't happened. He was not built that way. He had tried to rebuild himself into someone who could do exactly that, and he had succeeded at a lot of it, but not this part. Not when someone had put Maya's photograph in their hands. "All right," he said. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Show me the organization chart. All of it. I need to understand how Garrick's people are positioned and where the information leaks are." Nadine slid the chart across the table. Brenner looked at it for a long time. He noticed 2 things almost immediately, one that confirmed what he'd suspected. and one that surprised him. Merrick Dane, he said, pointing to a name in the convoy and ground security section. What do you know about him? Nadine looked at Tessa. Something passed between them. He's been with Lucian for 9 years, Tessa said. He's a driver. Convoy coordination. He knows every route, every movement schedule. He's your leak, Brenner said. We haven't been able to confirm. He's your leak, Brenner said again. Look at the timing of last night. The attack happened 12 minutes after your father's security team filed an internal update on Tessa's location. Who had access to that update? Nadine pulled a log from the pile. Her eyes moved across it quickly. She was quiet for a moment. 17 people, she said, including Merrick Dane. He's positioned at the right level, Brenner said. Close enough to the operation to receive critical information. Obscure enough not to be the first name anyone looks at. He sat back, and Garrick would have chosen him carefully. 9 years of established trust, invisible infrastructure. Tessa pressed her palms flat on the table. If Merrick is feeding information, then Garrick knows every protective arrangement you make, through official channels, Brenner said. Every convoy route, every safe house that gets filed through Lucian's team. All of it. The room was quiet. Nadine closed the log and set it aside with the particular controlled movement of someone who wanted to sweep everything off the table and was choosing not to. So we have a confirmed mole in the ground security team, she said. A corrupt police commander we've identified but can't move on yet, and an armed operative with 11 years of organizational knowledge who is planning his next move faster than we anticipated. She looked at Brenner. What do you need? Brenner thought about it. He thought about Garrick's face in the photograph. He thought about the bullet on his desk. He thought about 12 years of a locked room that had finally cracked open to show him something he'd known was there all along. We don't run from Merrick, he said. We use him. Nadine frowned slightly. Explain. Garrick knows we found the diner attack. He knows Tessa survived. He's going to be recalibrating, trying to understand what assets we have, what our next move looks like. He needs Merrick to tell him. Brenner leaned forward. So we tell Merrick something worth reporting. Tessa looked at him slowly. A trap. A specific one, Brenner said. We feed Merrick information about a convoy movement. Specific vehicles, specific routes, a specific time. Something that Garrick can act on. And when he acts on it, Nadine said, following it now, we're watching. More than watching, Brenner said. Whatever he sets up to destroy that convoy, we document it before he triggers it. Evidence he can't deny, captured by your team, admissible in federal court. He paused. And it tells us exactly what he's willing to do, which tells us how far along he is. Tessa was quiet for a moment. There was something in her face that was harder to read, now, not reluctance, but the specific weight of someone who understood what it meant to use people as instruments, even people who had betrayed her. If it goes wrong, she said. We build it so it can't go wrong on our end, Brenner said. He met her eyes. Garrick is going to move regardless. The question is whether we're ahead of him or behind him when he does. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Outside the window, the city was fully awake now. Traffic sounds drifted up, muffled, ordinary. The world going about its morning the way it did every morning, indifferent to the things happening in apartments above it. Brenner looked at the organizational chart again. He found himself thinking about Lucian the old man's face when he said, I know, the precise weight of those 2 words. He found himself thinking about Tessa going through financial records alone, pulling threads that could have gotten her killed at any point along the way, and not stopping. He found himself thinking about Maya's laugh in the photograph. He pulled the chart closer and started marking positions. There was a mole to use and a trap to build, and a man named Garrick Sloan who had spent 12 years operating in the comfortable assumption that Brenner Whitaker was buried deeply enough in the past to stay there. That assumption was about to become the most expensive mistake Garrick had ever made. Brenner worked through the morning without stopping, and he did not feel anything particular about what was coming. He was past feeling particular things about what was coming. He was in the part of himself that simply moved and planned and waited, and was very patient in the specific way of someone who had learned long ago that patience was the difference between winning and not winning, and that winning, in rooms like this one, was not measured in moments of drama, but in the careful accumulation of the right information, the right position, and the right timing. He circled Merrick Dane's name on the chart. Then he started building the trap. The trap needed 3 things to work: a believable piece of information, a clean delivery method, and enough time between the delivery and the action to confirm that Merrick was the one who had moved it. Brenner spent most of that first day working through the logistics with Nadine at the kitchen table, while Tessa made calls from the bedroom, coordinating with the federal attorneys handling Lucien's preliminary cooperation agreement. The apartment smelled like bad coffee and printer paper, and the particular staleness of a space being used as an operations center by people who hadn't slept properly in 36 hours. Nadine was good at her job. Brenner recognized it the way you recognize competence in another person, not through what they say about themselves, but through the small consistencies of how they work. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't ask questions she already knew the answer to. When Brenner proposed something she disagreed with, she said so directly and explained why, and twice she was right, and he adjusted accordingly. The convoy information needs to be specific enough to act on, Brenner said, but not so specific that it reads like a setup. Route timing, Nadine said, vehicle count. A destination that makes operational sense. Something Garrick would see value in hitting. Lucien in transit, she said. That's what Garrick wants most. If the information says Lucien is being moved to a federal processing facility on Thursday evening, Garrick will move on it. Brenner nodded. Thursday gives us 48 hours. Long enough for Merrick to report and Garrick to plan, short enough that Garrick can't do too much preparation. And the cameras? I need 4 positions. Exterior coverage of the convoy route and whatever approach Garrick's people use. Internal coverage of the vehicles themselves. He paused. And I need it all feeding to a secure off-site recorder that nobody inside Lucien's team knows about. Nadine looked at him for a moment. You don't trust anyone in his security structure. I trust that at least one person in it is actively working against us, Brenner said. Until I know it's only one, I trust the structure as a whole about as much as I trust a screen door in a hurricane. She almost smiled at that. Almost, I can get the equipment, she said. It'll take until tomorrow morning. That's fine. Tessa came out of the bedroom. She had her phone in one hand and looked like someone who had been having a difficult conversation and had decided to be done with it. The attorneys want the ledger in their possession before the cooperation agreement is finalized, she said. They're saying by end of week. That's not possible, Nadine said. I told them that. Tessa set the phone on the table. They're not comfortable with the timeline. They don't have to be comfortable, Brenner said. They have to be patient. He looked at her. The ledger is secure where it is. Yes. Then it stays there until Garrick is contained. Once he's contained, you walk it directly to Nadine's supervising attorney and nobody else. Hand-to-hand transfer, documented. Tessa nodded. She sat down at the table and looked at the organizational chart Brenner had been working on. He'd added handwritten annotations in the margins, timing notes, position assessments, question marks beside 3 names he hadn't resolved yet. You write like a doctor, she said. I write like someone who never expected anyone else to read it, he said. She looked at the chart for another moment. You circled 2 names I don't recognize. Vance Oren and Dale Pemberton, he said, both in the outer security ring, both with irregular check-in patterns over the last 3 weeks. He tapped the page. Could be nothing. Could be that Garrick has more than one line of information running. You think there are 2 moles? I think it's possible. I want to watch both of them separately from Merrick and see what moves. Tessa rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. It was a tired gesture, unguarded, the kind that surfaces when someone has run out of the energy required to maintain composure as a continuous performance. How are you doing this? She asked. Not to the room. To him specifically. Brenner looked at her. Doing what? This. She gestured at the chart, at the apartment, at the general shape of the situation. You walked into a diner 2 nights ago for a cup of coffee. You didn't ask for any of this. No, he said, I didn't. And yet here you are mapping organizational structures at, she looked at her watch, 11:30 at night. Someone put a bullet next to my daughter's photograph, he said. He kept his voice even. There's not really a version of that where I go home and pretend it didn't happen. She was quiet for a moment. Is she safe, your daughter? For now. He had called Maya twice more during the day. She was frustrated and confused and doing what he'd asked, which was everything he could reasonably request. He had not told her the full shape of it. He wasn't sure he was going to. I'll make sure Garrick understands she's not part of this, Tessa said. Directly. Through channels he'll believe. Don't, Brenner said. She frowned. Why? Because if you reach out to him to negotiate anything right now, you tell him we're more rattled than we are. You tell him the photograph worked. He looked at her steadily. Garrick is watching for weakness. Don't show him any. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Okay. Nadine, who had been listening to all of this without appearing to listen, quietly closed her laptop and said she was going to sleep for 4 hours and suggested they do the same. It wasn't phrased as a suggestion. Brenner stretched out on the couch without taking his shoes off and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. The next 48 hours moved the way high-pressure time always moves slowly in the foreground and very fast underneath, the sense of something building that you can feel but can't quite see yet. Brenner and Nadine positioned the cameras the following morning. 4 vehicles from Lucian's convoy pool were fitted with interior recording equipment. Exterior positions were covered by 2 of Nadine's people agents she vouched for personally, operating entirely outside the official case channels. The off-site recorder went into a storage unit on the north side of the city under a name that had no connection to any of them. The information about Thursday's convoy reached Merrick Dane through a chain that looked organic. Brenner fed it to one of Lucian's senior coordinators, a man named Aldous Penn, who Nadine's analysis had cleared as clean, framing it as a finalized transport plan requiring ground team confirmation. Penn documented it through the standard internal channels. Merrick, as convoy coordinator, received the documentation as a routine operational update. Brenner watched Merrick's behavior for the next 6 hours through a combination of physical surveillance and a tap on the internal communication system that Nadine had put in place 3 weeks earlier without Lucian's security team knowing. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Merrick made a call from a personal cell phone he used only occasionally and always in short bursts. 12 seconds. The call went to a number that traced to a disposable phone registered to nothing. That's it, Nadine said quietly. They were in a car 2 blocks from Lucian's primary facility, watching the feed on a tablet. 12 seconds is enough to pass a location, a time, and a vehicle count, Brenner said. Garrick will verify through his other sources before he moves. Let him verify. The information is consistent everywhere he looks. Brenner watched the feed. Merrick was walking back toward the facility now, unhurried, hands in his pockets. 9 years of established trust. 9 years of looking like exactly what he appeared to be. How does a man do that? Brenner said, mostly to himself. 9 years. Nadine was quiet for a moment. People compartmentalize better than we want to believe, she said. He probably told himself stories about it. That he wasn't really hurting anyone. That Garrick would win eventually anyway. That he was on the practical side of things. She paused. People tell themselves a lot of stories. Brenner thought about Lucian saying, I chose to protect those connections rather than disclose them. Different context, same basic mechanism. Thursday, he said. Garrick moves Thursday. Yes, Nadine said, he does. Thursday arrived cold and overcast, the sky the color of old concrete. The city moved through its morning at the usual pace trucks and commuters and the small dramas of ordinary days, while 12 vehicles in Lucian's convoy pool were being quietly emptied of everyone who was supposed to be in them. It took 4 hours to set up correctly. The decoy convoy would travel the route as planned, vehicles present and moving, appearing occupied. Hidden cameras would record everything from multiple angles. Nadine's external team would hold positions at 3 points along the route. A federal response team operating under a sealed authorization that bypassed the compromised local police channels was staged 2 miles out. Lucian himself was moved at 6 that morning to a secure location that no one in his ground security team was told about, in a nondescript sedan driven by Nadine's partner, via a route that had been decided at 5:58 in the morning by random selection from 4 prepared options. Brenner watched Lucian get into the sedan from across the parking structure. The old man paused before ducking into the car and looked across at Brenner. Something passed between them, not warmth exactly, not forgiveness, not anything that could be named easily. The acknowledgement of men who understand that certain kinds of settling of accounts require surviving what comes first. Lucian got in the car left. Brenner went to work. At 2:14 in the afternoon, the decoy convoy rolled out of the facility on schedule. At 2:27, the first device detonated. It hit the 3rd vehicle in the convoy, a position that would have placed it directly beside a transport containing Lucian, had Lucian been in the transport. The explosion was contained by design, because Garrick's people had used shaped charges rather than mass explosives, which told Brenner something about how much they wanted this to look like a targeted hit rather than a general act of destruction. Calculated, professional, and completely captured on 6 different cameras transmitting to an off-site recorder. The 2nd and 4th vehicles were hit within 30 seconds of the first, then nothing. The remaining 9 vehicles sat on the street in the strange quiet that follows sudden violence, and Garrick's people, whoever they were, wherever they had positioned themselves to trigger the devices, realized too late that no one was running. No one was screaming, no one was pulling bodies from the wreckage, because there were no bodies to pull. Nadine's response team was moving before the last echo cleared. They made 4 arrests at 2 positions along the convoy route. 3 men with remote triggering equipment and a 4th, who turned out to be a mid-level logistics coordinator from Garrick's operation, who had apparently decided that watching the outcome in person was worth the risk. It was not worth the risk. Brenner was on the phone with Nadine when the arrests came through. 4, she said. All alive. Triggering equipment recovered. Recordings intact. Garrick? A pause, not present. He didn't put himself anywhere near this. Brenner had expected that. Men like Garrick did not stand close to the things they set in motion. He'll know it failed within the hour, Brenner said. Yes, and then he'll adjust. Yes, she said again. Brenner was standing outside the storage unit on the north side of the city where the off-site recorder was housed. The afternoon light was flat and cold. A truck rumbled past on the access road. We got him on conspiracy and attempted murder, Nadine said. The recordings are clean. The chain of evidence is intact. On a normal day, that's enough to move. This isn't a normal day, Brenner said. No, she said, because on a normal day, Garrick doesn't have Commander Harlan Crew in his pocket. Brenner had been waiting for Crew's name to come up in this particular context. He'd seen it in the organizational chart with a question mark beside it. The question mark was gone now. Crew is police, Brenner said. Crew is the commanding officer of the Metropolitan Division that covers 3 of the 4 convoy route positions, Nadine said. If Garrick instructs him to challenge the chain of evidence, to raise questions about the federal operations authorization, to create procedural noise loud enough that the case gets mired in jurisdictional arguments. It doesn't matter how clean the recordings are, Brenner finished. Not in the short term. Long enough for Garrick to move his assets, destroy what can be destroyed, and disappear into the infrastructure he spent 11 years building. Brenner was quiet for a moment. He thought about the bullet on his desk. He thought about Tessa in the diner, going methodically from survivor to survivor with her steady voice and her careful hands. Crew, he said. Has he ever been directly recorded saying anything useful? Nadine hesitated. There was a conversation 3 months ago that one of my agents partially captured. Crew was discussing the Whitaker frame by name. Your name with someone we believe was Garrick's legal advisor. Discussing it in terms that made it clear, he understood it was fabricated and had agreed to support it. Something cold moved through Brenner's chest. Not surprise. The absence of surprise. He had known for 12 years that what happened to him was not an accident and not an error. Hearing it confirmed out loud was less satisfying than he would have imagined and more clarifying than he expected. Partially captured, he said. The first 40 seconds were clean. Then the recording degraded. What's in the first 40 seconds? She told him. He stood outside the storage unit for a moment and let the afternoon sit around him. I need access to Crew, Brenner said. That's not something I can arrange through official. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to arrange it officially. He paused. I need to know his patterns. Where he goes off the record. When he's not in uniform and not being watched. Another pause. Longer. Brenner, Nadine said carefully. I'm not going to hurt him, Brenner said. I need him to say the right thing in a place where saying it can't be walked back. He let that sit for a second. You said the first 40 seconds were clean. I need the next 40. Nadine was quiet for a long time. He has lunch every Thursday at a restaurant called Alderman's. On the west side, she said finally. He goes alone. He takes a back booth. He's usually on his personal phone for the first 15 minutes before his food comes. Who does he call? Thursdays, it's usually Garrick's legal advisor. A man named Foster Keel. She paused. Keel called Crew 3 times today already. He's going to be looking for reassurance that the convoy operations fallout can be managed. And Crew is going to tell him what he thinks he can deliver, Brenner said. Yes, Nadine said. He's going to say things that assume no one is listening. Then I'll make sure someone is, Brenner said and hung up. Alderman's was the kind of restaurant that had been upscale 20 years ago and was now respectable in a slightly faded Waygood wood paneling, white tablecloths, a lunch crowd of business people, and city officials who valued discretion over atmosphere. The back booth was separated from the main floor by a half partition, and Commander Harlan Crew occupied it at 12:47 with a glass of water and a personal cell phone, and the comfortable authority of a man who had operated in the margins of official power for long. Enough that he'd stopped looking over his shoulder. Brenner was already there. He'd arrived 40 minutes early and taken a table near the partition, near enough for the small recording device to reach. Far enough that Crew's peripheral scan wouldn't register him as anything other than a man eating lunch alone. He'd ordered soup and eaten half of it. He looked like someone waiting for a meeting that was running slightly late. Crew arrived, settled into the booth, ordered coffee, and started dialing. Brenner didn't move. He kept his eyes on his bowl and listened to the one-sided conversation with the particular quality of attention that doesn't look like attention. Crew started with the convoy operation. He was careful, the way a man is careful when he believes he's careful, which is to say not careful enough. He talked around specifics with the vocabulary of people who have developed a private shorthand for things they don't want said plainly. He referred to the transportation matter and the federal overstep and our mutual understanding regarding the Whitaker situation. That last phrase. Brenner kept his face entirely still. The recordings are a problem, Crew said into the phone. Pause. No, I understand that. But there are questions about the authorization chain that I can raise formally. If the operation didn't follow proper interagency notification protocols, another pause. Foster, I've managed more complicated things than a bad recording. You need to let me handle this the way I handle things. Pause. The Whitaker situation was managed. This gets managed the same way. Brenner turned a page in the newspaper he'd brought as a prop and said nothing. Crew talked for 11 more minutes. By the time his food arrived and the call ended, the recording device in Brenner's jacket pocket had captured 47 seconds of very usable material, including Commander Harlan Crew explicitly referencing the Whitaker frame by name in a context that made his knowledge of its fabricated nature unmistakable, and explicitly agreeing to deploy his institutional authority to obstruct the federal recordings from the convoy operation. Brenner ate the second half of his soup. He left before Crew's coffee was refilled. He was 2 blocks from the restaurant when his phone rang. It was Tessa. The tone of her voice when she said his name told him what was coming before she finished the sentence. They took him, she said. They have my father. Brenner stopped walking. When? He said. An hour ago. Garrick's people. The location Nadine moved him to. Her voice cracked slightly at the edges and then steadied itself. Someone knew. Someone told them. One of the 2 names Brenner had circled on the organizational chart. Vance Orrin or Dale Pemberton. He'd been watching Merrick and missed the second line. Is he alive? Brenner said. We think so. There's a video. She stopped. Breathed. Brenner. There's a video. I'm coming to you, he said. Where are you? She told him. He was already moving. The video was 42 seconds long. Lucian Vossler sat in a wooden chair in a large dim space industrial, high-ceilinged, the kind of building that had been something functional and was now empty. His hands were bound behind him. There was a cut above his left eyebrow. He was looking at the camera with the expression of a man who had spent a long time being afraid of things that weren't this, and was now encountering the real version. He did not look broken. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who has arrived at the consequence of their own decisions and is finding it exactly as heavy as they always knew it would be. A voice spoke off camera, not Garrick's voice a proxy, someone hired to deliver the message. The voice stated a location, the Alder Crown Theater, a landmark building on the eastern edge of the city that had been closed and condemned for renovation 8 years ago, and had sat untouched since the development company that bought it collapsed. The voice stated a condition, the authentic ledger, delivered before 6 a.m. The following morning, the voice stated a consequence at 6 a.m. Whether or not the ledger was delivered, the building and its surroundings would be destroyed. The explosives were already in place. Then the voice said one more thing. The former SEAL will be blamed. There is already evidence being prepared. By morning, the city will understand that Brenner Whitaker, disgraced veteran, was working with organized crime. The footage will make it clear. The video ended. Tessa was standing with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. Nadine had her phone out, already working contacts. Brenner watched the video a second time. He watched it a third time. Not the words. The background. The way the light fell. The shadows at the edge of the frame. The quality of the silence underneath the proxy's voice. He's in the theater, Brenner said. Not somewhere near it. The acoustics in the video match a large interior space with exposed structural elements. The original Alder Crown had a basement renovation that was never completed. There would be access tunnels. You've been in the building? Nadine said. No, I've read the city infrastructure maps. They're public record. He looked at her. The access tunnels connect to a utility corridor that runs under 3 blocks. There's an entry point on Pelham Street. If Garrick has people inside. He does, Brenner said. But people watching the visible entrances aren't watching the underground access. They're not expecting someone to come up from underneath. He paused. What's the footage you mentioned? The manipulation. Nadine set down her phone. Her face was carefully controlled. We intercepted a partial file transfer 4 hours ago. We couldn't stop it. We got there too late. Someone has edited footage from the Harbor Light Diner the night of the attack. She paused. It removes the first 12 seconds of the relevant sequence. Without those 12 seconds, the footage shows you moving toward the attacker from a position that looks coordinated rather than responsive. It looks like I was working with them, Brenner said. It looks like you were part of the attack, she said. With the Vossler organizational connection already on record from 2013 and the manufactured evidence from tonight's convoy operation framing you as the architect. She stopped. It's already moving through media channels. There's a story running on 2 stations. Tessa turned away from both of them. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to the room, and Brenner could see the tension in her shoulders, the particular physical shape of someone who is holding themselves together through sheer structural will. This is because of me, she said. Her voice was quiet and steady and entirely without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. This is because of Garrick, Brenner said. I brought you into... Garrick chose this 12 years ago, Brenner said. Everything that's happening now is the end of something he started a long time before you walked into a diner. You didn't bring me into anything. He let that sit for a moment. I'm in it because I chose to be in it. She turned around. Her eyes were dry. She looked at him with an expression that he recognized because he'd worn it himself at certain points in his life, the look of someone who has run out of the luxury of guilt and has to decide what to do next. What do we do? She said. Brenner looked at the frozen last frame of the video. Lucian in the chair, the dim industrial light, the beginning of the consequence of 11 years. He thought about the Pelham Street utility corridor. He thought about Crew's voice on the recording. He thought about the 47 seconds in his jacket pocket and what they were worth if the right people heard them before morning. He thought about the bullet beside Maya's photograph. He thought about 12 years of a locked room and the name Garrick Sloan, and a man who had spent 11 years believing that the people he damaged and discarded stayed damaged and discarded. We split it, Brenner said. Nadine, you take what we have on Crew, the recording from Alderman's, combined with the partial capture from 3 months ago, and you get it to your supervising attorney tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. It has to be in official federal hands before 6A. M or Garrick uses Crew to bury everything. Nadine nodded. She was already putting on her jacket. Tessa, Brenner said. She looked at him. The ledger, he said. Can you get your hands on a copy? Not the original, a duplicate that passes initial examination, but won't hold up to deep forensic analysis. She blinked. A counterfeit. Garrick is asking for the ledger because he wants to destroy it. He won't examine it thoroughly until it's in his hands. We need something that buys us time inside that building. He paused. Can you do it? She thought for a moment. I know someone, she said slowly. A document specialist. It would take most of the night. You have most of the night, he said. Make the call. And you, she said. He was already looking at the city infrastructure maps on Nadine's laptop. Pelham Street, the utility corridor, the access points. I'm going to learn everything there is to know about the Alder Crown Theater's basement, he said. He said it the way he'd once said things before difficult operations, not with drama, not with the performed confidence of someone who needed to convince themselves. Just level and practical and focused, because there was a specific problem in front of him and specific work required, and he had spent his whole adult life being a man who did specific work. But underneath all of it, underneath the planning and the maps and the tactical thinking, something else was happening that he wouldn't have admitted to Nadine or even fully to Tessa. He was angry, not the cold-managed anger from the previous days. Something hotter and more honest than that. Someone had taken Lucian, a man Brenner had no reason to feel anything for except the complicated weight of shared history, and put him in a wooden chair in a condemned building and sent a 42-second video as a negotiating position. Someone had put Maya's photograph in their hands. Someone had spent 12 years making Brenner Whitaker carry responsibility for a failure that had been manufactured specifically to destroy him. And that someone was in a theater on the eastern edge of the city, or connected to the people who were And in a few hours, Brenner was going to go through an underground utility corridor and find out exactly what it looked like when 12 years of patience finally had somewhere to go. He pulled up the architectural schematics for the Alder Crown and started working through the basement layout. Outside, the city evening was settling in. Lights were coming on in buildings. Somewhere a few streets over, ordinary life was moving at its ordinary pace. People coming home and eating dinner and watching whatever they watched and going to bed. Brenner traced the access route with his finger on the screen. He estimated 4 hours before he needed to move. He used all 4 of them. The Pelham Street utility access point was a rusted iron hatch set into the sidewalk between a closed laundry and a parking structure, the kind of infrastructure detail that a city accumulates over decades and then forgets. Brenner had memorized its exact coordinates from the architectural schematics. He found it at 2:14 in the morning without a flashlight, working by feel and the dim orange wash of a street lamp half a block away. He'd parked 4 streets over. He'd walked in a route that avoided the 3 camera positions he'd identified on the Alder Crown's exterior perimeter. Garrick's people, almost certainly, watching the building's visible approaches while the underground corridor sat beneath their attention like something that didn't exist because it wasn't on anyone's operational checklist. That was the persistent error of people who planned through organizational structures rather than physical reality. They covered what they could see. They forgot what they couldn't. Brenner lifted the hatch, lowered himself into the darkness, and pulled it closed above him. The corridor was narrow and smelled of decades of standing moisture and old concrete. He moved by feel and by the thin beam of a penlight no larger than his finger, keeping the light low and directed at his feet. The schematics had shown a straight run of approximately 300 meters, terminating in a maintenance junction beneath the theater's original basement foundation. From there, a service ladder accessed a sub-level mechanical room that the 1990s renovation had sealed off but not removed. He moved carefully. Not slowly careful and slow are different things, and he had never confused them. He moved at the pace that let him feel what was beneath his feet before committing his weight, that let him hear what was ahead before he arrived there, that let him be in the dark corridor without being consumed by it. He'd done this in worse places. He'd done this in places where the smell was worse, and the stakes were sharp, and the people waiting at the other end were better trained and better equipped than anything Garrick Sloan could field. He had done it when he was 26, and doing it for something he believed in without reservation. And he was doing it now at 37 for reasons that were more complicated and probably more honest. He thought about Tessa, who at this moment was sitting in a car 2 blocks from the theater's main entrance, waiting for his signal. He'd argued against her being there at all. She'd looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has heard that argument from other people in other contexts and has already decided the answer is no. He's my father, she'd said. I understand what he is. I understand what he's done. But he is trying to do a different thing now, and if he dies in there before he can do it, then everything he knew dies with him. She'd paused. And Garrick wins. Brenner hadn't responded to that because there wasn't a response that was both honest and useful. I won't get in your way, she'd said, but I'm not sitting somewhere safe while you go in there alone. He'd given her a radio, a simple 2-way unit, the frequency agreed upon. He'd told her to stay in the car until he signaled, and then to bring the counterfeit ledger through the theater's main entrance, the visible, documented approach while he came up from underneath. The plan was not elegant. Elegant plans required more time and more certainty than they had. What this plan had was functional parts and the right people in the right positions and a willingness to improvise through whatever the functional parts didn't cover. Brenner had spent enough of his life improvising. He was comfortable with it, in the way you get comfortable with anything you've survived enough times. He reached the maintenance junction at 2:41. The service ladder was iron, bolted to the wall, holding his weight without complaint. He climbed slowly, feeling for soft spots in the rungs before trusting them. The sealed sub-level mechanical room above him was dark and smelled of rust and stagnant air and the particular deadness of a space that hadn't been breathed in for years. He eased the access panel open, dark. The outlines of old mechanical equipment boilers, junction boxes, pipe runs barely visible in the near-total absence of light. He climbed through, settled onto the floor, and held completely still for 60 seconds. Listened. The building above him was not silent. He could hear movement not directly overhead, but somewhere in the main structure. Footsteps that had the particular rhythm of a security patrol, unhurried, repeating. The walk of someone covering ground because they've been told to cover ground rather than because they expect to find anything. One person, maybe two. The sound bounced oddly through the building's bones. He heard something else. Voices. Distant above, muffled by the structure between them. He couldn't make out words, but the cadence of one voice carried a particular quality, measured, deliberate, the pacing of someone who is accustomed to the room listening. Garrick. Brenner moved toward the stairs. The basement level of the Alder Crown had originally been designed as a secondary performance space, a smaller venue beneath the main theater, connected by a central staircase and two service corridors. The renovation that was supposed to convert it into a modern rehearsal facility had been abandoned mid-process, leaving it in a state of structural incompletion that was more useful to Brenner right now than a finished floor plan would have been. There were gaps in the walls where partition framing had been started and stopped. There were shadows and angles that a completed space wouldn't have offered. He came up through the service corridor and stopped at the edge of the main staircase opening. Lucian was 12 meters away. He was still in the wooden chair, still bound, positioned near the center of what would have been the rehearsal floor. The cut above his eye had dried. His head was up. He was watching two men who stood near the far wall with the particular alertness of people waiting for something to happen and not being comfortable with the wait. Garrick Sloane was standing near the staircase that led to the main theater above the one Tessa would come through. He had his back partially to Brenner, and Brenner had a moment to see the man in person rather than in a photograph. The photograph had been accurate. There was nothing dramatic about him. Medium height, gray hair cut close, a dark jacket. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, and his attention moving through the space in the methodical sweep of someone who has been assessing environments for a very long time. Not anxious. Focused the way a man is focused when he is in control of the situation and is simply waiting for the final piece to arrive. Harlan Crewe was there too. Brenner hadn't expected Crewe. He filed it away without reacting. Crewe stood near one of the support columns out of uniform, wearing a dark civilian coat with a gun, holstered at his hip, and the expression of a man who had stepped considerably further into something than he'd originally agreed to and was now committed by the weight of everything behind him. Two guards near Lucian. Garrick and Crewe on the staircase side. Brenner counted additional movement on the upper level, at least two more people, possibly three, the sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. 6, maybe 7 total. He checked his watch, 2:53. He'd told Tessa to enter at 3:15, 22 minutes. He needed to know about the explosives before anything else moved. He keyed the radio once the agreed signal for "I'm in position" and waited. One key back from Tessa. Received. He moved along the service corridor toward the basement's eastern wall where the schematics had shown the original utility conduits running. The renovation team had opened portions of the floor to run new infrastructure and then abandoned the project, leaving sections of the subfloor exposed. If Garrick's people had placed explosive devices in the building, and the video had been specific about it, the basement conduit runs were the logical placement. Enough structural proximity to bring down the load-bearing elements without requiring excessive material. He found the first device 12 feet along the eastern wall. It was compact and professionally assembled, fixed to the conduit housing with adhesive straps, a receiver unit attached to the primary charge. He found a second one 6 feet further. A third near the junction of the east and north walls. He didn't touch them. He photographed each with the penlight angled carefully and memorized the receiver frequencies printed on the units. He also noted the wiring configuration on the third device, something that shouldn't have been there. A secondary mechanical trigger, a timer backup set independently from the remote detonation system. The kind of redundancy that said whoever built these had anticipated that someone might attempt to jam the remote frequency. Garrick had planned for interference. Brenner stood in the dark and thought about that for a moment. The signal jammer he'd positioned outside the theater, a unit borrowed from Nadine's equipment inventory, set to cover the standard remote detonation frequency range, was running. It had been running since he entered the Pelham Street access point. If Garrick attempted remote detonation, he would get nothing. But the mechanical backup changed the math. He needed to get to that third device and the other two before whatever backup timer Garrick had set reached 0. He needed to do it without alerting the guards, without alerting Garrick, and without doing it so early that the movement gave away his position before Tessa arrived. He went back through the timing in his head. 20 minutes. He needed to find all the devices and assess the mechanical backups. He needed to hold his position until Tessa was inside and had Garrick's attention. He needed to move on Lucian while Tessa was managing the front of the room. It was a lot of things to hold in sequence under pressure. He had done more with less. He keyed the radio twice the signal for complications, hold approach, and started working faster through the basement. Tessa entered the Alder Crown Theater at 3:16. She came through the main entrance with the counterfeit ledger in a flat document case under her arm. And she came alone, which was what the video had demanded, and she walked through the dark lobby and up the main staircase and down through theater's access corridor toward the secondary performance space stairs with a steadiness that was costing her considerably more than it appeared to be costing her. She had been in difficult rooms before, boardrooms where the people across the table wanted things from her that she had no intention of giving. Meetings with attorneys and investigators and her father's people where the ambient hostility was thick enough to be tactile. She had learned to move through hostile spaces with the surface presentation of someone who was not afraid, which was a different skill from actually not being afraid, and one she had developed over years of necessity. This was different from all of those. This was a man who had already tried to kill her twice and had her father in a chair. And the counterfeit ledger under her arm was a document that would not survive close examination. And somewhere in the basement below this building, a man she had no right to trust the way she trusted him was working against a clock she couldn't see. She came down the stairs into the performance space. Garrick turned. He looked at her the way she had imagined he would, the evaluating look of someone checking a box, confirming an arrival, moving to the next step of a plan. He glanced at the document case. He glanced behind her at the empty staircase. "You came alone," he said. "You asked me to come alone," she said. "People don't always do what they're asked." "I did," she said. She stopped walking about 10 feet from him and stood there with the document case against her body and her chin level, and her voice entirely steady. "I'm here. My father is alive." That was the agreement. Garrick looked at Lucian. Lucian was watching Tessa with an expression Brenner, from the shadows of the service corridor entrance, would later describe to himself as the look of a man who is seeing something in his child that he created the conditions for and is not sure he deserves to witness. "The ledger," Garrick said. "First I want to see that he's all right," Tessa said. Teresa Lucian started. "Are you hurt?" she said to him. Direct. Not asking Garrick's permission. "I'm fine," Lucian said. His voice was rough. "You shouldn't be here. You're in a chair," she said. "So yes, I should." Garrick stepped forward, the ledger. Tessa held his eyes for a moment. Then she extended the document case. Garrick took it. He handed it to Crew without opening it, and Crew moved to a table along the wall where a portable lamp had been set up. That was Brenner's window. While Crew's attention was on the document case, and Garrick's attention was on Tessa, and the two guards near Lucian were watching the exchange at the table, Brenner came out of the service corridor and moved along the north wall, 12 meters to Lucian. He covered it in the dark, low and fast, using the shadows cast by the structural columns as he'd planned from the schematics. He reached Lucian's chair from behind and crouched beside it. Lucian felt the presence and went absolutely, still the instinct of a man who has spent decades, Spence Brady's reading the difference between the approach of someone who wants to harm him and someone who doesn't. He didn't turn. He didn't make a sound. Brenner put his hand on Lucian's wrist and found the binding. Zip ties. Heavy gauge. He pulled the cutter from his jacket pocket and worked it quietly, keeping his body low and using Lucian's own frame as cover from the sightlines of the two guards. The first tie released. Then the second. "Don't move yet," Brenner said against Lucian's ear. Almost no sound, a shape of words. Lucian gave the smallest possible nod. Across the room, Crew had opened the document case and was examining the ledger under the portable lamp. Garrick stood with his back to the room, watching Crew. Tessa was watching Brenner. She caught his eye for exactly the fraction of a second. She allowed herself and then looked back at Garrick. "I have a question," she said. Her voice was steady and slightly louder than it needed to be. Creating sound. Keeping attention. "I want to understand something before this goes further." Garrick turned back to her. "You're not in a position to negotiate conditions." "I'm not negotiating," she said. "I'm asking. You built everything in that ledger in my father's shadow. You used his structure, his relationships, his people." She paused. "Why? You had access to everything he had. You didn't need to build a separate layer on top of it." Garrick looked at her. Something shifted in his face to not anger, something more complicated. The look of a man who is being asked a question he has not been asked before and is deciding whether he cares to answer it. "Your father was always planning to end it," Garrick said. From the beginning, somewhere underneath everything, he was planning the exit, building toward cooperation, toward legitimacy. He said the word with a particular texture that was hard to name. Not contempt exactly. Something older than contempt. I built what I built because I understood that when he finally made his choice, everything would collapse. I needed something that survived the collapse. This was always coming, Tessa said. The moment he decided to cooperate with federal investigators. Yes, Garrick said. This was always coming. From across the room, Cruz said Garrick. His voice had a specific quality. The quality of a man who has just found something unexpected in a document he expected to be straightforward. Garrick turned. Brenner moved. He came up from behind Lucian's chair in one motion, crossed the distance to the nearest guard in 3 steps, and had the man down and controlled before the guard had completed his turn. The second guard was faster. He got his weapon halfway up before Brenner redirected his arm and put him against the column, hard enough to take the fight out of him without taking him fully out of the picture, which was a precise calibration that required more control than simply hitting harder, and Brenner had always been better at precise calibration than at hitting harder. The room erupted. Garrick moved toward Tessa, toward the case, toward the fake ledger, already understanding that something was wrong. Lucian stood up from the chair. Crew drew his weapon. Brenner put himself between Crew's line and Lucian in the half-second he had to make that choice, and the calculation was instinctive. Crew would shoot Lucian if he had a clear angle, because Lucian alive and talking to federal attorneys was Crew's worst possible outcome. Garrick, he was less sure about Garrick was operational, and operational men didn't shoot when there were other options still on the table. Put it down, Crew, Brenner said. Crew held the weapon level. His face had the look of a man who had fully understood, for the first time tonight, that he had passed a point of no return some time ago without properly acknowledging it. You have no idea what you've walked into, he said. I have a recording of you at Alderman's this afternoon, Brenner said. It's already with federal attorneys, 47 seconds. You mentioned my name specifically. Crew's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. That recording and everything from the convoy operation is in official federal hands as of 2 hours ago, Brenner said. Whatever you do in the next 30 seconds doesn't change that. The question is what you want the next 30 seconds to look like. Crew's weapon stayed up. His jaw worked. He was running the math that people run when the structure they've been standing on has given way and they are trying to find something solid in the falling. He didn't find it. His arm dropped. Not all the way the weapon came to his side rather than the floor, but the angle was gone. Garrick made his move. While Crew and Brenner were squared off, Garrick had gotten close enough to Tessa to put his hand on the document case not to hurt her, to take it from her, and when he opened it and saw the counterfeit ledger up close, his face went through several things very fast. Surprise, calculation, and then a different kind of decision. He looked at Tessa. Where is it? He said, quiet. More dangerous in the quiet than he'd been in anything else. Safe, she said. The same word she'd given Brenner 3 days ago. Teresa, he stepped closer. The real ledger. Where is it? With people who aren't here, she said, and who don't need anything from tonight to go forward. The federal attorneys have what they need, Garrick. It's already done. That was a slight overstatement of where things actually stood. The ledger transfer was scheduled for morning. Not complete, but Tessa delivered it with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided that a useful truth and a timed truth are functionally the same thing. Garrick stared at her, and then he did something that Brenner had not fully predicted. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, for a phone. A burner unit, a single-purpose device, and his thumb moved to a single button on the screen. Remote detonation. Brenner was already moving. He'd seen the reach, registered it, understood it, but the room was 12 meters wide and Garrick's thumb was already pressing. Nothing happened. The jammer outside caught it. The frequency was covered. Garrick pressed again. Nothing. Brenner got to him. He took Garrick's wrist and controlled the hand with the phone and used the momentum of his own approach to redirect Garrick against the wall. Controlled, deliberate, the kind of force that stops a situation without escalating it into something worse. The phone clattered to the floor. Garrick didn't fight back the way Brenner expected. He laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. Check your watch, Garrick said. Brenner's stomach dropped about 2 inches before his face did anything. The mechanical backup. He'd found 3 devices. He'd needed to assess all their timers. He hadn't finished. He'd been pulled to his position when Tessa's entry time arrived. There had been a 4th device somewhere in the basement that he'd run out of time to locate, and Garrick's expression was telling him that the mechanical backup was already running and had been running since before Tessa walked through the door. "How long?" Brenner said. Garrick said nothing. Brenner looked at Lucian. Lucian looked at Crew. Crew, and this was the one moment in the evening that Harlan Crew chose the right side of something. Possibly because it was the only side that didn't end with the building falling on him, said, 8 minutes. He set the mechanical at 3:15. 8-minute window. 8 minutes. Brenner let go of Garrick and turned to the room. "Everybody out," he said, "now. Up the stairs and out the main entrance. Move." The two guards, one of them still shaky from the column, needed no second instruction. They went for the stairs. Crew went with them, and it was impossible to know whether he was making a choice or simply moving with the group, but either way he was moving away from the detonation point, and that was fine. Lucian looked at Garrick. There was a specific quality to that look. The look of two men who have spent 11 years in a working relationship that was always going to end here, in some version of here, and both of them knew it, and neither of them had fully wanted to know it until right now. "Go," Brenner said to Lucian. He was already moving toward the service corridor. "Get Tessa out. Main entrance all the way out. Get clear of the building. The explosives." "I've got it," Brenner said. He didn't wait to see if Lucian moved. He went through the service corridor at a run. 7 minutes, roughly. Less. He came down the access ladder to the basement faster than he'd come up it, not carefully, not taking his time on the rungs, trading safety margin for speed in the way you do when the math requires it. He hit the basement floor and went straight to the eastern wall. First device. Timer running. He found the mechanical unit, traced the circuit, and did what needed to be done with hands that were steady. Not because he was calm, but because he had done enough of this to separate the steadiness of his hands from whatever was happening in the rest of him. The first device went dark. He moved to the second. 45 seconds. He found the mechanical backup and killed it. He stopped. The third device was where he'd found it before. He moved to it. He started working the mechanical unit. His hands were bleeding slightly from the descent he'd come down the ladder, fast enough to catch his palm on a rough rung and hadn't noticed until now. The blood made the small components slicker than they should have been. He adjusted his grip and kept working. 5 minutes on his estimate. Maybe less. He heard footsteps on the floor above him. Heavy. Running. Coming toward the basement stairs. He didn't stop working. The footsteps reached the top of the basement staircase and started down. Brenner got the third device's mechanical unit isolated. He disconnected the trigger circuit. The footsteps reached the basement floor. Harlan Crew. Not running away. Coming back. Brenner looked up from the device and registered the expression on Crew's face, not the math-running look of a man making a tactical decision, but something older and harder to name. The look of a man who has lived for a long time in the space between what he was supposed to be and what he actually did, and who is exhausted by the distance. "There's a fourth one," Crew said. "He told me there were 4. I watched him place them." He moved to the north wall. "Here." Brenner went with him. Found it, started working. "You came back," Brenner said. Flat. Not a judgment. An observation. "I wasn't going to," Crew said. "But you—" Crew didn't say anything to that. The fourth device was more complex than the first 3. The mechanical backup had an additional failsafe that required isolating 2 separate circuits in the right sequence. Brenner's hands worked through it while his brain tracked the time. He was past his estimate now. He didn't know exactly how far past. "Hold this," he said to Crew, indicating a component that needed steady pressure while he worked the second circuit. Crew held it. His hand was steady. Whatever else the man was, he held it steady. Brenner worked the second circuit. He was aware, in some part of himself that ran parallel to the task, that Tessa was outside, that Lucian was outside, that the federal response team Nadine had staged was almost certainly moving toward the building right now, and that whatever happened in the next 30 seconds was going to be the shape of everything that came after. He disconnected the final circuit. The device went dark. Crew let out a breath. It was not a controlled breath. It was the breath of a man who has been holding something at the structural limit of his capacity and has just been allowed to set it down. Brenner sat back on his heels. The basement was quiet around them. The old building breathed its stagnant air. Somewhere above, the footsteps of Nadine's response team were already moving through the main floor. He looked at his hands. The blood from the ladder rung had dried across his palm in an irregular line. "You're going to federal custody tonight," Brenner said to Crew. "I know," Crew said. "The recording from Alderman's is already in evidence." "I know that too." Brenner stood up. His knee ached from the hard landing at the bottom of the access ladder. He ignored it. "Why'd you come back?" he said. He asked it the way he asked things when he actually wanted to know the answer, which was without inflection. Crew looked at the dark device on the floor for a moment. "I told myself a lot of stories," he said. "Garrick did what he needed to do. I was on the practical side. Nobody was really getting hurt that wasn't already getting hurt." He paused. "The Whitaker situation. Your situation. I told myself he stopped. Started again. I told myself you were already compromised. That the frame wasn't that different from what the truth would have been eventually." "But it wasn't true," Brenner said. "No," Crew said. "It wasn't." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Come on," Brenner said. He walked to the stairs and went up, and Crew followed him, and when they came through the main entrance into the cold night air, the scene was the organized chaos of a federal operation arriving at its conclusion: vehicles, lights, agents moving with the specific coordinated purpose of people who have been waiting for a moment and are now executing against it. Nadine was there. She looked at Brenner's bleeding hand, and then at Crew, and then back at Brenner. "Clear," she said. "4 devices all neutralized," he said. Crew assisted. Nadine looked at Crew for a moment. "Take him," she said to 2 agents behind her. They moved. Crew went with them without resistance. Brenner looked around for Tessa. He found her 20 feet away. She was standing at the edge of the cordoned area, and she was looking at him with an expression that was almost impossible to read, because it was composed of too many things happening simultaneously: relief and exhaustion, and the particular rawness of someone who has held themselves together for an extended period and is only now, in the immediate aftermath of the worst of it, feeling the weight of everything they were holding. She had her arms crossed against the cold. She was not crying, but she was close to it in the way that the most controlled people are close to it, through the jaw, through the eyes, through the slight unsteadiness of breathing that gets masked by the stillness of everything else. He walked to her. She looked at his hand. "You're bleeding." "It's from the ladder," he said. "It's not serious. You went to disarm them alone." Crew helped with the last one. She blinked. "Crew." "He came back," Brenner said. He shrugged slightly. The shrug of a man who has stopped being surprised by the specific ways people make their final choices. "It happens." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, Brenner could see Lucian sitting on the rear bumper of one of the federal vehicles, a blanket around his shoulders, a medic examining the cut above his eye. 2 agents stood near him, not restraining him but present, the shape of custody without the formality of it yet. That would come, and Lucian knew it, and from where Brenner stood, the old man looked like someone who had arrived at something he'd been building toward for a very long time and was finding it exactly as heavy as he'd expected. Garrick was in the back of a vehicle 20 meters away. Brenner couldn't see his face. He didn't particularly need to. "The ledger," Brenner said to Tessa. "In the morning." "I know," she said. "I'll deliver it personally." "Hand to hand with Nadine's supervising attorney," he said. "Documented transfer." "I know, Brenner." A pause. "I've been planning this for 3 weeks." He looked at her. She looked at him. Somewhere in the city, ordinary life was moving toward ordinary morning. The first gray suggestion of it was beginning to appear at the eastern edge of the sky, the night's darkness softening at its farthest border. The kind of change that happens so gradually you don't see the moment it tips, only the fact that it has. "My shoulder," Brenner said. He reached back and found the place where the hard landing had caught him, not the palm, a different thing. A wrong landing on the access ladder that he'd been setting aside since it happened. He pressed his fingers against it and felt the particular deep ache of something that was going to matter considerably more in 12 hours than it did right now. Tessa watched him do this. "You're hurt, I'll live," he said. "That's a low bar," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. The same almost from the diner, the first night, when she'd told him the non-answer was the only answer he was getting, and he'd found it funnier than he wanted to. "It's been a low-bar week," he said. She put her hand briefly on his arm, not long, not dramatic, the restrained touch of someone who wants to say something that doesn't fit into words right now and is choosing the smallest possible physical expression of it instead. Then she withdrew it. "Go get your shoulder looked at," she said. "In a minute," he said. He stood there in the cold early morning and looked at the Alder Crown Theater, its brick face, its darkened windows, the scaffolding from an old renovation along its south side, and thought about the things that had happened in the last few days, and the 12 years before them, and the specific weight of being a man who has been carrying a locked room for a long time and is only now beginning to feel what it's like without it. He didn't feel light. That was the thing nobody told you. You carry something long enough, and when you set it down, you don't feel light. You just feel different. A different kind of tired. A tiredness that has something underneath it that isn't tiredness at all, that you'd have to sit with for a while before you knew exactly what to call it. Nadine appeared at his shoulder. She looked at the building, then at him. Garrick is in custody, she said. Crew is in custody. The 4 devices have been confirmed neutralized by the bomb disposal team. A pause. The evidence chain is intact. All of it. Good, he said. The media story about you, she said. The edited diner footage. It's already being challenged. The original footage is in the hands of the network's legal department. I made sure of it an hour ago. By morning is fine, he said. She was quiet for a moment. You know, she said, in 22 months of building this case, you are the single most inconvenient variable I have encountered. Sorry, he said. Don't be, she said. Inconvenient variables sometimes solve problems that the planned approach couldn't. She walked away, back toward the operational center of the scene, already on her phone, already moving through the procedural cascade that would occupy the next 72 hours of her professional life. Brenner stood there a little longer. His shoulder ached. His palm had dried blood on it. He was 37 years old and had spent the last 4 days doing things that his body had done before, but hadn't been asked to do in a while, and it was making its opinion known in the specific accumulated way of a body that has been patient and is now presenting the bill. He pulled out his phone. He looked at the time. 4:49 in the morning. He called Maya. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either, and when she said, "Dad," he heard in her voice the exact shape of how long the night had been for her, waiting in her apartment with incomplete information, and the particular fear of someone who knows the person they love is somewhere dangerous and cannot do anything except wait. "I'm all right," he said, a long pause. "Okay," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "Okay, I'm sorry about the last few days," he said. "I'll explain everything." "Not tonight, Dad," she said. "Just, are you actually all right? Not the answer you give when you're trying not to worry me." "Actually all right." He thought about it. The question deserved a real answer. "Yeah," he said, actually. She exhaled, long and slow. "Come home," she said. "When you're done with whatever you're not telling me about." "I will," he said. "Get some sleep." He hung up. He stood in the cold for another moment. Then he went to find someone to look at his shoulder, because Tessa had been right about the bar being low, and he was prepared to raise it, at least by that much. The shoulder took 6 weeks to heal properly. The medic at the scene had called it a grade 2 separation, the kind of injury that sounds manageable until you try to sleep on it, at which point it becomes the organizing fact of your existence for the better part of 2 months. Brenner wore a brace for 3 weeks and ignored the physical therapist's instructions about range of motion exercises for another 2, which was exactly the kind of patient behavior that made the therapist's jaw tighten every time he came in for a session.
"You're not 25.
The therapist told him on his 4th visit. "I'm aware," Brenner said. "Your body heals at the rate it heals. You can't negotiate with it." "I'm not negotiating. I'm just not doing the exercises." "That's the same thing." He did the exercises after that. Not because the argument had moved him, but because Maya called twice that week and asked whether he was following the therapist's instructions, and he had already lied to her about enough things in the recent past that lying about physical therapy felt like one too many. The world during those 6 weeks moved at the pace that consequences move faster than people expect and slower than they want. Garrick Sloan was formally charged on day 3. The federal charging document ran to 41 pages and covered conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of justice, financial crimes extending across 11 years, and given the recordings, the device evidence, and the testimony of the 4 men arrested along the convoy route, the prosecution's case was the kind that federal attorneys describe, in their careful procedural language, as substantial. What that meant in plain terms was that Garrick's attorney made 2 phone calls and then stopped making optimistic statements to the press. Harlan Crew was charged separately. His cooperation in the theater basement, the device he'd helped neutralize, the testimony he ultimately provided about his 11-year relationship with Garrick's operation earned him a cooperation agreement that his attorney described as the best possible outcome given the circumstances. Crew didn't dispute that characterization. He entered a guilty plea on the obstruction and conspiracy charges, provided a full accounting of his involvement in the Whitaker frame, and was sentenced 7 months later to 6 years in a federal facility. He would serve 4. Brenner was present for neither proceeding. He had given his depositions and his statement and his testimony in the careful forensic setting of federal interviews, and he had answered every question put to him and corrected every factual error he encountered. And then he had gone home and not gone back unless asked. He was asked 3 more times over the following months. He went. He answered. He went home again. The original Harbor Light Diner footage was released publicly on day 4. Brenner didn't watch the coverage. Maya did and called him to describe it, which was close enough. The footage showed what had actually happened, the sequence of events in the diner, the angle of the shots, the trajectory of Brenner's movement, from stool to counter to shielding position, and it was unambiguous in the way that real footage is when it hasn't been trimmed to remove the 12 seconds that change everything. The network that had run the edited version issued a correction and an apology that was carefully worded enough to acknowledge error without clearly attributing fault. Brenner didn't find the apology satisfying, which he had expected. He had been around long enough to know that the restoration of a reputation doesn't feel like restoration. It feels like the removal of something that shouldn't have been there in the first place, which is a different sensation entirely and a much less triumphant one. The federal investigators reopened the 2013 case file on day 12. Brenner found out about it from Nadine, who called him on a Tuesday morning while he was at the shop doing the kind of paperwork accumulates when you've been absent from your business for a week under difficult circumstances. She told him it was being treated as a formal review rather than a new investigation, which was the procedural language for a process that was already largely concluded before it officially began. The outcome was not in question. The question was the form the acknowledgement would take. The form it took, 6 weeks later, was a letter on official federal letterhead signed by 3 people, whose titles were long enough to fill an entire line. The letter stated, in language that was precise and bureaucratic and almost entirely free and of human warmth, that the investigation had concluded that the evidence used in the 2013 determination against Brenner Whitaker had been fabricated, that Brenner Whitaker bore no culpability for the events described in that determination, and that his record was to be formally corrected to reflect this conclusion. He read it twice, folded it, put it in the desk drawer in his office at the shop. Then he went back to the paperwork he'd been doing. Maya called that evening because she had her own contacts and had already heard before he'd had a chance to decide whether to tell her. Her voice on the phone had a quality he hadn't heard from her in a long time, something released. Something that had been held in careful suspension for years and had finally been put down. 12 years, Dad, she said. Yeah, he said. How are you feeling about it? He thought about it, honestly, the way he'd been making himself think about things, honestly, since the night at the theater, since the conversation with himself in the aftermath, when he'd recognized that the habit of setting things aside was not the same as the habit of being all right. Quieter, he said. I feel quieter than I did. She was quiet on her end for a moment. That's good, she said finally. I think that's good. Yeah, he said, I think so too. Lucian Vossler surrendered formally on day 7. He walked into the federal building on a gray morning, accompanied by his attorney and by Tessa, who stood beside him in the lobby in a way that was not performance and not obligation, it was something else. Something that had been worked out between them in conversations Brenner was not part of and had no information about, and that was right. The cooperation agreement Lucian provided covered 11 years of operational detail, financial structures, network relationships, and the names of individuals in positions of institutional authority who had received payments from the organization. That list was longer than the federal attorneys had anticipated. The cases it opened would take years to complete. Lucian also voluntarily transferred substantial financial assets. The mechanism was complex and took months to finalize to a compensation structure overseen by an independent administrator. The structure was designed to reach individuals and families who had been directly harmed by the organization's operations. It did not reach everyone who deserved to be reached, because it never does, and Lucian's attorney made no claim that it did. What it did was something rather than nothing, in the way that late accountability often produces something rather than nothing, and has to be accepted as such. Lucian received a sentence that reflected both the severity of what he had built and the genuine weight of what he had provided in dismantling it. He was 63 years old. He would be in his early 70s when he completed his sentence, if he completed it. He understood this. He had walked into the federal building that gray morning understanding it. Tessa told Brenner about the moment later, months after. She'd been standing beside her father in the lobby when he stopped before the security checkpoint and stood there for a moment, not hesitating, not reconsidering, just pausing in the way of someone marking a moment before they stepped through it. He had looked at her. "I'm sorry it took this long," he'd said. She had not told him it was fine, because it wasn't fine. She had not told him she forgave him, because she hadn't fully worked out yet what she forgave and what she was still carrying. She had said the only true thing available to her in that moment. "I know," she'd said, and then he'd gone through the checkpoint. The shop reopened in the third week. Brenner's two mechanics, Danny, who was 28 and meticulous, and Paul, who was 51 and had been doing this since before Danny was born, had kept things running in his absence with a competence that was slightly embarrassing, given that Brenner was technically the owner. He came back to find the books in order, the bays occupied, and a stack of messages from customers who had been told he was dealing with a family matter and had been appropriately patient. He spent the first 2 days, mostly in his office, doing the paperwork. The physical work of the shop required the shoulder to be further along than it was. Danny told him to sit down twice, and Paul said nothing, but positioned himself to cover the tasks. Brenner kept almost attempting, which was a more effective intervention. On the third day, Tessa came. She didn't announce it. He looked up from the desk in the mid-morning, and she was standing in the bay door in a coat that was too nice for an auto shop, holding 2 cups of coffee from the place 2 blocks over that Brenner never went to because it cost 3 times what coffee should cost. And she looked at the shop with the expression of someone who has been imagining a place and is now seeing the actual version of it for the first time. "This is where you work," she said. "That's generally what a shop is," he said. She made a small gesture at the organized workspace, the tools, the vehicle currently on the lift. "This is what you built. After everything, you built this." "It's a repair shop," he said. "I wouldn't oversell it." She crossed the bay and handed him the expensive coffee. He took it without objecting, which cost him something, and she saw it cost him something and didn't comment on it. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which he'd noticed she did. She was the kind of person who decided whether she was welcome and then acted accordingly, and her read on the room was usually correct. "Marlowe Meridian Group's board met yesterday," she said. "How'd it go?" "The way boards go when they've had a difficult month and want someone to tell them things are stabilizing." She wrapped both hands around her coffee. "I told them the truth, which is that the legitimate operations are entirely stable. The connected to my father's network operations are being wound down in an orderly way, and by the end of the year the company will be something I can be comfortable running." A pause. They were not uniformly thrilled, but they accepted it. "You didn't need their acceptance," Brenner said. "No," she said. "But it's easier to do what needs doing when the people around you are engaged rather than anxious." She looked at her cup. "I've been running things by force of will for a long time. I'm trying to learn the difference between that and actually leading." Brenner looked at her. There was something in the honesty of that statement, the specific self-awareness of someone acknowledging a limitation without performing humility about it, that he found harder to look at directly than he expected. "You're doing all right," he said. He meant it plainly, without decoration. She looked up. "Was that a compliment?" "Don't push it," he said. She smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile without something else immediately behind it, without relief or tension, or the managed quality of someone whose emotional expression has been operating under professional conditions. It was just a smile, small and real. "I bought the diner," she said. He hadn't known that. Harbor Light. The owner was considering selling anyway. The attack damaged the front section enough to require significant repair. "I made him an offer." She paused. "I'm renovating it. Keeping everything that made it what it was, the layout, the counter, the general feeling of the place, but fixing the structure properly. Installing better safety features." Another pause. "I want it to be a place where people who are rebuilding their lives can find steady work. People coming out of difficult circumstances. People who need somewhere that doesn't ask too many questions about what came before." Brenner thought about that. "That's a good thing," he said. At the moment, it was all he had, and it was enough. "I also," she said, and then stopped. She looked at the coffee cup. She looked at the wall. She had the particular posture of someone who has prepared what they want to say, and is now discovering that preparation doesn't actually make it easier. "I wanted to say something to you. And I'm not, as you may have noticed, I'm not naturally the best at the part of a conversation that isn't about logistics or information." "I've noticed," he said. "I'm working on it. Take your time." She looked at him. "What you did. In the diner, in the theater, all of it. You didn't know any of it. Not to me, not to my father, not to the situation. You had a life, a real one. Small maybe, but yours. And I walked into it well. I was working behind the counter of it, which is its own particular irony, and everything that followed was because you made choices you didn't have to make. I had a bullet next to my daughter's photograph, he said. Before that, she said. In the diner. You didn't have to pull me down. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what was at stake. She paused. You just moved. Brenner didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about the diner, the sound of the window, the fraction of a second in which his body had simply gone, without calculation, without assessment of personal cost. The thing that happened when years of training meet the right stimulus and produce action before the thinking part catches up. But it wasn't only training. He knew that. He'd had training and stayed still before, in his life, when training met calculation and calculation said the risk wasn't worth it. What happened in the diner was something else. Some decision made below the level of decision, rooted in something more basic than tactics. He didn't have a clean way to explain it. He wasn't sure he needed to. You were going to get shot, he said simply. She held his eyes. I know, she said. That's what I'm trying to say. You couldn't let that happen. Even to a stranger. She paused. That's not nothing. That's actually a fairly extraordinary thing about a person. He was quiet. It's also, she said more carefully now, the thing that makes it very hard to... She stopped again. Tessa, he said. She looked up. You're not bad at this part, he said. You just think you are. Because you're measuring yourself against some standard of ease that doesn't apply to anything real. She blinked. People who are actually bad at it, he said, don't notice that it's hard. You notice? That's the whole difference. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, Danny was running the lift motor, and the sound of it filled the bay with its particular mechanical voice, and somewhere on the street a horn sounded and faded, and the ordinary morning went on as it does, indifferent and continuous. I'd like to keep doing this, Tessa said. Whatever this is. The coffee. The talking. I'd like to do more of it. That's specific, Brenner said. I'm being specific on purpose, she said. Because the vague version of this conversation leads to misunderstanding, and I have had enough misunderstanding in my recent life to last for a while. He looked at her. She looked at him. All right, he said. All right, she said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a scene. It was two people who had been through a particular and unusual thing together, arriving at the quiet agreement that they weren't done with each other, which was a beginning, a real one. Not the performed kind, not the kind that exists to be witnessed, but the kind that happens in ordinary light, in a repair shop on a Tuesday morning over expensive coffee. Maya came to dinner 6 weeks after that. She drove in from the city on a Friday evening and arrived at Brenner's apartment with wine she'd actually researched rather than grabbed off a shelf, which told him she'd been thinking about the evening more than she was going to admit. Tessa was already there. She and Brenner had been at the table for half an hour, talking about something that Brenner later couldn't remember the specific subject of one of those conversations that isn't about its stated subject when Maya knocked. Brenner answered the door, and Maya looked at him with the particular look of a daughter who is evaluating a situation she has been privately evaluating for weeks through incomplete information, and then she looked past him to Tessa at the table. Tessa stood up. There was a moment brief, unceremonious, in which three people who had all been moving through the same gravity field from different directions came to rest in the same room. You're Maya, Tessa said. You're Tessa, Maya said. She looked at the table, then at her father. Am I interrupting something? Dinner, Brenner said. There's enough. There's definitely enough, Tessa said. I cooked more than we needed because I wasn't sure about portion sizes, and your father was not helpful with specifics. Maya looked at Brenner. He shrugged. She handed him the wine, took off her coat, and sat down at the table. Dinner was not seamless. It was the slightly awkward thing that first dinners are, when the people at the table are navigating more than they're saying, when the conversation has the quality of three people feeling for the edges of something without naming what the something is. Brenner was quiet in the way he was always quiet in social situations that required managing, which meant he was present and attentive and contributing just enough to keep things moving without being the engine of it. Maya, who had her mother's social intelligence and had always been better at rooms than her father, carried more weight than she should have had to carry. She asked Tessa about Marlowe Meridian Group with genuine curiosity rather than the performed interest of someone being polite, And Tessa answered with the directness that Brenner had learned was her default mode when she trusted the room. And somewhere in the middle of a conversation about the company's restructuring, Maya said something that made Tessa really laugh. The unguarded kind and the texture of the evening shifted into something easier. After dinner, while Brenner was in the kitchen doing the dishes, with the particular thoroughness of a man who finds mechanical tasks restful, Maya came and stood in the doorway. "She's not what I expected," Maya said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know." "Someone more," she searched for the word. "Corporate. Remote." "She runs a multi-billion-dollar company," Brenner said. "I know, that's why I expected remote." A pause. "She's not remote." "No," he said, "she's not." Maya was quiet for a moment. He could hear her leaning against the doorframe, the particular sound of it. He'd known her long enough to know her silences as well as he knew her words. "Are you happy?" she said. He turned off the water, dried his hands, turned around. She was watching him with her mother's eyes, the direct, patient look of someone asking a real question and prepared to receive a real answer. "I'm getting there," he said. She nodded slowly. "That's the most honest answer you've given me in about 4 years." "I know," he said. She pushed off the doorframe and came and hugged him, which she did rarely enough that it carried its full weight each time. He held on for a moment. "I was scared," she said quietly. "Those days when I didn't know what was happening. I was really scared." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just don't do it again if you can help it." "I'll do my best," he said. She pulled back and looked at him. "That's also the most honest answer you could give." He went back to the dishes. She went back to Tessa and the table and whatever conversation followed. Through the kitchen doorway, he could hear the murmur of their voices, the rhythm of two women finding the shape of each other, the particular cadence that meant things were going to be all right in that direction. He finished the dishes and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the street below. It was an ordinary street. Parked cars, a pool of lamplight, someone walking a dog in the cold. The city going about its Friday evening with the magnificent indifference of a city that doesn't know or care what happened in its corridors. 2 months ago, the detonated convoy vehicles, the condemned theater, the basement with its 4 dark devices, the recording at Alderman's, the letter from 3 people with long titles. It doesn't hold any of it. The city doesn't. You do, and then you do with it what you can. Brenner had spent a long time believing that what you do with it is contain it. Keep it in a locked room. Move it far enough from your daily life that it doesn't contaminate what you're building. He had been reasonably good at this, and reasonably miserable in the particular way of someone who is good at something that is fundamentally the wrong approach. What he was finding now slowly, without any dramatic revelation, in the gradual way that real things tend to arrive, was something different. Not resolution. Resolution was the word for the end of a story, and lives were not stories, and the things you carry don't get resolved so much as they get incorporated. They become part of the structure of you. The question is whether the structure they become part of can still hold weight, can still build something, can still be a thing that people want to stand near. He thought it could. He was still figuring out how. 3 months after the Alder Crown, Brenner stood in a conference room in a federal building and answered the last set of questions anyone official needed from him. The attorney across the table, young, thorough, professionally kind, thanked him for his time and his cooperation, and told him the case against Garrick Sloan was progressing, and that his contributions to the evidence record had been substantial. "I know," Brenner said. Not arrogantly, just factually. He'd been there. He knew what had been collected and what it was worth. Walking out of the federal building into a gray afternoon, he ran into Nadine in the lobby. She was coming in as he was going out, carrying a folder and moving with her usual directed energy, and she stopped when she saw him. "Last deposition," she said. "Last one," he said. She looked at him for a moment. In the months since the theater, their contact had been professional and necessary depositions, evidence reviews, the occasional question that required his specific knowledge of the physical events. She had been consistent and competent and entirely unsentimental, which he had respected. "You know," she said, "there are positions. Federal Tactical Protection Detail, investigative support. Your record is cleared. Your background is exactly what several programs are looking for." She paused. "I could make calls, I know," he said. "I appreciate it." "But," she said, "I have a shop," he said, "and a daughter nearby. And," he thought about how to finish that sentence, "things I'm figuring out." Nadine looked at him with the expression of someone who understands an answer without requiring it to be elaborated. "All right," she said. She shifted the folder under her arm. "Garrick's trial starts in February. You'll probably be called as a witness. I'll be there, he said. She nodded, started past him, stopped. For what it's worth, she said, not turning around. 22 months. I built that case for 22 months. You walked in on day 1 of week 4 and changed the shape of the whole thing. A pause. That's not nothing. She went through the door and across the lobby and was gone into the interior of the building. Brenner stood in the lobby for a moment. Then he went outside. The Harbor Light Diner reopened on a Thursday morning in late spring. Tessa had overseen the renovation personally, which meant she had strong opinions about the counter height and the light fixtures, and the way the replacement windows were installed, and the contractor had found her a thorough and occasionally exhausting client. The structure was sound now. The front section that had taken the most damage from the attack had been rebuilt with materials that were better than what had been there before. The layout was the same counter stools, same back booths, same percolator in more or less the same position, and it smelled like coffee and industrial cleaner on opening morning in the particular way that places smell when they're clean and ready and haven't yet been broken in again. Brenner was there. He hadn't planned to make a thing of it. He arrived at 7:40 in the morning and sat at the far end of the counter, the stool, with the sightline to both exits, because some habits are structural rather than chosen and ordered coffee. The woman who brought it was in her 30s, steady-handed, with the careful manner of someone who was grateful for the work and was not going to waste the gratitude by doing it carelessly. She didn't know who he was. She didn't need to know who he was. He wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was good. Through the new front windows larger than the old ones, the replacement glass running floor, to ceiling, the morning street was visible in its entirety. People moving, cars. The ordinary motion of an ordinary morning that didn't know or care. That 6 months ago this stretch of sidewalk had been ringed by 12 black cars in the rain, and a man had sat on that stool and heard the world go wrong. Tessa came in at 8:15. She'd come from the office she went in early most days, which she'd once described to Brenner as a habit she was trying to moderate, and suspected she never entirely would, and she was carrying a bag, and her coat was slightly damp from the morning air, and she looked at the diner with the expression of someone who has built a thing and is seeing it full of people for the first time. She saw Brenner at the counter and came and sat beside him, which was not the stool she would have chosen on any other basis, but was the right one for today. The woman brought her coffee without being asked, which meant Tessa had been in enough during the renovation that she'd come a known quantity. They sat for a moment without talking. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the particular silence of two people who have run out of the things they needed to work through and have arrived at the quieter, more ordinary territory of people who know each other. It looks right, Brenner said. The window frames are 2 inches off from what I specified, she said. I can't tell, I can. Then you'll live with it, he said. She looked at him. I probably will, she said. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. A woman with a stroller paused at the corner. The morning proceeded. My father called yesterday, Tessa said. She said it in the neutral tone she used for things she was still deciding how to feel about. He's been moved to a facility that has a work program. He's teaching a financial literacy course to other inmates. A pause. His attorney says he finds it useful. Having something to teach. Brenner considered that. People need something to do with what they know, he said, even when what they know came from the wrong places. She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. I'm not ready to visit, she said. I want to be honest about that. I'm not there yet. You don't have to be, he said. But I might be someday, she said. That's the part I'm still figuring out. That's the right part to still be figuring out, he said. She looked at him. In the morning light through the new windows, she looked exactly like herself, not the CEO performing composure, not the woman running from armed men in a diner, not the daughter standing in a federal building lobby. Just herself, which was something Brenner had come to understand, took considerably longer to see in a person than their surface features suggested. You know what I think about, she said sometimes. Tell me that night, she said. The first night. You were sitting here, and you were just a man having coffee at the end of his day, and I was just a woman working a shift. And for those few minutes before everything happened, that was all it was. She looked at the counter. I wonder what that version of the night would have looked like. If no one had come through the window. Brenner thought about it. Probably, he said, I would have finished my coffee, left a reasonable tip, and walked home. And I would have closed up and gone back to my apartment and looked at the ledger for the 400th time. And nothing would have changed, he said. She was quiet. Everything would have changed later, she said. Because it was already in motion. The convoy Garrick, all of it. It would have happened somewhere. Just not here. Yeah, he said. Probably. So maybe, she said, the window breaking was the best thing that could have happened. He looked at her. That's a generous reading of nearly being shot. I'm trying to find the generous reading, she said. I've been in therapy for 8 weeks, and apparently that's part of the process. He almost laughed. The almost law he'd been doing since the first night in this diner. It was getting closer to actual laughter each time. How's the therapy, he said. Uncomfortable, she said. And useful. Which my therapist says is what it's supposed to be. She paused. She also says I have a tendency to intellectualize difficult emotions rather than experience them, which I intellectualized for about a week before deciding she was right. This time he did laugh. It came out fully, unguarded, the kind that doesn't have time to be controlled because it arrives before the control mechanism engages. It was a short laugh, and it didn't announce itself, but it was real. Tessa looked at him with something that was quietly pleased. I've been trying to get that for 6 months, she said. Don't note it, he said. You'll ruin it. She turned back to her coffee. She was smiling. They sat at the counter of the Harbor Light Diner on a Thursday morning in late spring, and the diner was full of people who were not in danger, and the street outside was full of a city that had no idea what had happened in this building and didn't need to. And somewhere across town, a repair shop was open and doing its ordinary business. And somewhere in a federal facility, a man was teaching people what he knew. And somewhere in a city apartment, a young woman was going about her Friday with the particular lightness of someone whose father is all right. None of it was perfect. The shoulder still ached on cold mornings. Brenner had a therapist, too. Now Tessa had made a case for it with the directness she brought to cases. She decides that she was right about, and she was right about it. And 3 sessions in, he'd found himself saying things to a neutral stranger that he'd been setting aside in locked rooms for so long, he'd forgotten how much space they were taking up. It was uncomfortable. It was useful. He understood now why that was the description. There were trials still to come. Garrick's in February. A civil proceeding involving the compensation structure for Lucian's victims that would take years. Things still moving through the system that his name was attached to. There were conversations with Maya still needed. The real ones, the underneath-it-all ones about years of distance and what built the distance and what it cost both of them. They were having them slowly the way real conversations happen, not in one sitting, not resolved, but incrementally more honest each time. There was the thing between him and Tessa, which had no name yet and didn't need one yet. It was real and it was unfinished, and they were building it in the ordinary way, without dramatics, without the pressure of consequence making it feel more urgent than it was. Coffee in the shop, dinner with Maya, calls in the evening about nothing in particular. The small domestic accumulation of 2 people letting each other into the actual texture of their lives. This is the thing that nobody tells you about the end of a war. Not the movie version of the end, where someone stands in the light and something swells in the background, and the meaning is unmistakable. The real version, where you survive and the surviving is quiet, and what comes after is not triumph but simply time ordinary, unannounced, asking nothing of you except that you show up in it. Brenner had spent a long time believing that the life he was living was a temporary arrangement, a holding pattern, that the real version of his life was somewhere behind him, lost in 2013 or earlier, and what he had now was a reduced thing. A repair shop and a coffee habit and a daughter he'd spent years failing to reach across a distance he'd partly created. He understood now that the life in front of you is the actual life. There is no other version being held somewhere in reserve. The repair shop was real. Maya was real. The stool at the end of the counter with the sight line to both exits was real. The woman sitting beside him was real and complicated, and not what he'd planned for, and precisely what the moment had produced when he'd decided in the fraction of a second, before thinking could interfere, that he couldn't let her get shot. You don't plan for the things that change your life. In Brenner's experience, they tend to arrive at 11:47 at night through a window that's being replaced, in the person of someone you don't know yet, asking nothing except that you be the person you already are. He picked up his coffee. The morning light came through the new windows at the angle that it comes through east-facing windows in late spring, flat and clean and without drama. Tessa was watching the street outside with the quiet expression of someone who is where she meant to be. Brenner drank his coffee. The war was over. The life was here. He was paying attention to it at the end.